Welcome to Harmony Talk, a podcast about dreamers and doers. Here, people from all walks of life tell us about their dreams and the moment they knew there was no turning back as they went from dreaming to doing. This podcast is sponsored by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. My name is Greg Frigoletto, your host for this episode. Today, I am joined by Robert May. Robert is the creator of Senart Films, a production company designed to discover new talent and uncover worthy stories that offer more than entertainment. Robert is a producer, director, and writer of independent films such as The Station Agent, The Fog of War, and Bonneville, as well as the documentary Kids for Cash, to name a few. Senart stories have collectively garnered over 40 awards, including the Oscar, Bafta, Independent Spirit Award, and Human Rights Award. His films have showcased the talents of household names such as Jessica Lange, Kathy Bates, Peter Dinklage, and Bobby Cannavale. Robert is constantly working and is currently in production on a project making us extremely grateful that he could join us today on Harmony Talk. Robert, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Greg. Hey, I want to clarify something. I don't want your viewers to think that I literally wrote and directed all of those projects that you listed, particularly like The Station Agent, for example. I did direct and I did write. It's part of what I do as a producer and writer-director, but all of our projects are not cross-collateralized with the credits, so to speak. I produced all of them, directed a couple, and wrote a couple.
That's great. And in a little bit, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that. But before we do, I'd want you to know, Robert, that this is a podcast that looks to inspire by sharing great stories, like your story, that demonstrate that dreams can become a reality. In other words, dreamers become doers. The best part of the journey is typically found between the dreaming and the doing, kind of like the magic that you find between the dots when you're connecting the dots. And as I learned from speaking with you several times prior to today, Senart Films and being a producer is not exactly how your story started. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to get to that part of your story in just a few moments. Instead, I'd like to begin a different way. I, like millions of others, am absolutely fascinated and entertained by the film industry. It's something that, we all do, we all love. And whether it's a documentary, comedy, an adventure film, or whatever the genre, people admire artistry and people love a good story. And in that regard, do you remember being a kid where a certain film or a piece of art provided you that aha moment where the seed was planted? Did that happen early for you, or was that something that came later?
Well, I've always been interested in movies and film, and a film that I still talk about today was an epic film back in the day, Dr. Zhivago. And I was just a kid when Dr. Zhivago came out. I remember being captivated by that story and the epic nature of it, I suppose. But with stories like that really had meaning and impact. In that particular case, it was a love story, but under duress, under terrible circumstances. It stands today as one of those best epic films of all time. But there's others too that were inspirations for me. One of them is Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. I also saw it when I was pretty young and too young to have seen it, but In Cold Blood just struck me. I knew it was based on a true story and it was about this trauma and tragedy, but I liked the way it was told. It's interesting because I had an opportunity to produce the Capote movie, which was called Capote. There were two films that were about Capote. One was called Famous, and the other one was Capote. And the Capote script, which Philip Seymour Hoffman played Capote, he made an appeal direct to me to produce it. And I loved the idea of it. And we started working on it. The problem was, though, that there was another film that was competing with it that was also in production or going into production. And literally that was the one thing as an independent producer, I didn't want to be part of it. Studio movies are faced with this all the time when there's two movies that all of a sudden get into production about the same subject matter or the same thing. And I was really scared away and didn't do the Capote movie. However, in the end, the Capote movie won an Oscar. I should have done it. It's one of those should have done it. And I had the access and had the script and had, the pieces together to be able to produce it, but opted not to. And I'm friendly with the folks that did the other movie as well. So it was a little bit bittersweet. Their movie came out after Capote. But, that's an example. I liked music and I liked film. Even in high school, we made films in our English class, which is something I really wanted to do. Didn't think I could do it, but something I wanted to do.
So, with the Capote example, that's a shoulda, coulda, didn't, but perhaps it's okay because it came out, really well, and maybe you would have had a different spin on it. And I find it interesting as you're talking about those early inspirations. Those were heavy topics. Those, kids that were maybe your age at the time were viewing things a little differently than you were. And it also sounds to me like as you're taking all of that in and finding something that you're interested in, you started to formulate maybe the idea that you weren't going to be on the acting side of it. Were you initially and always drawn to the behind-the-scenes production side of it?
Yes. I never wanted to be an actor. I went to a Kodak cinematography workshop, I recall, along the Charles River in February. It was the coldest I've ever been, ever. We had to not only work with camera equipment, but we also had to literally take turns acting out various parts. And I hated that. I just hated that part. It was just not something I'm comfortable doing. I was very fascinated by the nuts and bolts of the work in the industry and how films get made and the army of people that are required to pull it off. But more importantly, I was inspired by story. Those two movies I mentioned, In Cold Blood and Dr. Zhivago, are big topics. And there's a lot of tragedy in both of them, but there's a lot of drama and it's real. While Dr. Zhivago wasn't actually factual, it was based on many facts that were then available, but it wasn't completely factual. Whereas In Cold Blood was pretty close to what actually happened. And so I've always been fascinated by true stories or stories that have been embellished only to the point that they're understandable, but they're still based on a true story, as opposed to something more superficial.
It's all about, I don't care what the industry, it's always about people. And I would imagine that a good piece of art connects with people on some sort of visceral level in a way that they can connect with. And I would imagine, that's what you're always striving to do. Is that how you would interpret how a movie is successful?
The stories I'm interested in are character-driven. I'm interested in seeing characters in extraordinary situations, faced with extraordinary matters, family, friends, community itself, good, bad, the ugly, all of it. We go through life, we're never unscathed. We all have some marks from going through a life. And I'm fascinated by other people's lives. In fact, when I'm in a conversation with somebody, I'm generally really curious, and I don't stop asking questions to the point of annoyance for some folks I know. And I'll ask questions that people are afraid to ask, but I'll ask them in a respectful way. I mean, I'm not out to make fun of people. I'm just really curious about folks. I look for stories like that, whether they be a narrative fiction film or whether it be documentary. It's really what drives me.
I would say we live in a world where everyone has a story. There is no exception. And like you were saying, whether it's a movie that you're telling or it's a story you hear from an individual in a conversation, everyone has a story, and included in that is the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, you had mentioned about being inspired in high school. So your interest was there. However, the path you went down was something different. I think folks would be interested to hear a little bit about your first career and how that happened.
Even though I wanted to be involved in films, not even direct, although I did eventually do that, it was really produced because I knew what I wanted to do. But I grew up in a small town with classmates that had different dreams than I did, for sure. And I was always like dreaming, literally, about the things that I wanted to do. My parents were always supportive of me, but my dad in particular, he was concerned about, well, how are you going to make your way in life? How are you going to make an income? How are you going to make money? And I had no idea, but it became pretty obvious that it wasn't going to be in film because all of the counter conversations about it. No one said you shouldn't try, but it was really more about how are you going to do it? And of course, I had no idea how I was going to do it.
Were you expressing at that time that that's the path you wanted to take?
Yes, because when I finally decided this was what I was going to do as a second career, it wasn't a surprise at all to my folks. They're like, well, that makes sense because they always heard it. Now, to people who didn't know me that well or knew of my early passion, they were shocked that I would make such a transition. But for my folks, they knew, and they thought that because I already created something, not in the film industry, but created something that maybe I could actually do it. So I pursued that. But it took a while. I was interested in a lot of things. I'm fascinated about how things work anyway. And I was always interested in electronics and electrical sort of things. But I also was an EMT. I was an emergency medical technician. And I at a very young age. And I was one of the first in the state of Pennsylvania at a young age. A friend of mine and I, we decided we wanted to become EMTs. And I did. And ran on an ambulance for quite a long time. It was volunteer position. I was even fire chief. And those times of my life were incredibly important as I look back because, I think I have a lot of empathy as a person. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in character-driven stories. But, I also think back as an EMT when I would approach an ambulance and I was smaller than a lot of the other first aid folks. And plus I had the certification as an EMT. So I was often the one that had to go into a car that was upside down or help extricate somebody. So I was with people in some of their dire moments trying to help them. And it impacted me a great deal for everything that I've done in my life. And so, my path was not a straight line. When I finally figured out what I wanted to do, that was also something that I sort of dove right into, certainly without a whole lot of experience, but a lot of passion.
The last time we had spoken, you had mentioned that you ran a business for 25 years, successful years in a different business. If you could tell us a little bit about what that business was and when that was coming to an end for you, how did you know, okay, now it's time. I'm not going to stop dreaming. I need to move now into the doing part of what that is.
Right. What I was pursuing, I wanted to become an electrical engineer. That's what I thought made sense for me because it was a sensible business. Engineers can make a living and so forth. But while I was working for the fire department also, and it was during that period of time that I also became curious about alarm systems and how alarm systems work. For some reason, I became interested in it's like, well, how could you detect a burglar coming into it? Like what kind of sensors, what kind of things make up that sort of thing. So ultimately, I thought, well, that sounded like a decent business. And it was one that my folks thought made sense too, because it sounded practical, although they had no idea how I was going to do that either. And neither did I. But, I decided I was going to dive into that and created a company called Automatic Detection Systems. It was in Wayne County, actually. A goal there was to provide the best service possible. I came from a family. My father was a service provider who instilled that in all of us, that service is what people want. That's what you have to provide at the highest level you can. And so I decided to jump into that business. And I had some early success because I really cared about the customer. I really cared about what they had to say and quickly created a clientele that was pretty notable. Our monitoring center was in the Wayne County Jail. I had to go meet the sheriff. Now, I was really young when I did all this, by the way, and I had to go meet the sheriff and talk the sheriff into considering us putting a monitoring center there to monitor our clients' alarms. And eventually the county commissioners agreed to do that. And that's how I started. And then I was trying to determine, well, what am I going to do? Because I can only get so big in that area. And I thought I probably need to move to be able to take advantage of the skill sets that I think I had developed and also in other people, because I was able to bring on other folks to work with me that were really sharp and we learned together. And I wanted to be able to capitalize on that. And how was I going to do that in a small community? So I decided that I was going to approach the biggest security company in the northeastern Pennsylvania region and try to buy them, which was a ludicrous idea because I didn't have any money to do that, but I had the passion and I had the will to do it. I was completely ignorant on how that could possibly happen, but I was coming from a good place. I was motivated for all the right reasons. I felt like I had the goods. I didn't have the length of experience, let's say this guy did, that had been running this company since 1963, but I had the passion and I created an image of a little company that looked really big, and we weren't. We had a bank and we had a McDonald's and we had a Kmart back in the day. That's it. But the way we presented it, you would think we have all the Kmarts and lots of banks and lots of McDonald's, but we didn't. But I knew how to parlay that into something that was genuine and took notice. So anyway, I walked into the offices of, at the time was AAA Alarm. And this was, in the early 80s. He thought I was there to sell to him. And I said, I'm interested in buying your company. He started laughing at me. And I'm like, why are you laughing? And he said, because what makes you think you can do it? I said, well, I know I can do it. Question is, can I afford it? And it was clear I couldn't, but he had taken notice of me and the company that I created. I only learned this way after, but he liked me and he was inspired by the passion I had for the business. And he was at a point where he wanted to go off and do something else. And so the bottom line there was he created a deal to be able to sell the company to me and pay him over time. And that's what I did. And so then we consolidated the company, became a very large operation at that time. Our services were ranked 1% nationwide for the services we provided, all high-end services. We did residential, commercial, industrial, all life safety, asset management. So I was able to apply my interests like in whatever life-saving that I may have done as an EMT into that. And I did that. I had a great time doing it and great team. Most of the people that I worked with are still there today running the company because I sold that company in 1998 to Vector Security, which is one of the largest in the country right now. And the people that I worked with all the way up, the woman who was my right-hand person, she's a second in command in the company and all of Vector today. So I was ready to get out. I had done what I wanted to do. And I thought, hey, this is the time for me to pursue some other interests. And that's when I got into the film industry.
So to jump into the film industry, from all of what you just said, that's a leap in regard to it's very different than what you were doing. And if you're going to make that leap, where do you begin? How did you know where to go and how did it start?
It wasn't as much of a leap in my mind in some ways because I tried to use all my creative abilities to create presentations to our potential clients, focus on the delivery of services, checking in to see what kind of work we were doing, the quality of work, surveying the customers, building a word of mouth. What that business was managing minutia. The security business was managing minutia 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every detail. It's a detail business. You miss a detail, something bad could happen in the middle of the night. And so the film industry is very similar in that way. It's not so much life and death, but it's managing minutia. There are so many pieces to creating a project. And for example, one of the things that folks know in the film industry is when you're talking about a successful film, a successful production starts with a successful pre-production. And then there's something called pre-production. So in pre-production is when you start to line up all the details that you're going to need to address in creating a film. And then the pre-production is when you finally get the details established. Now you have to start implementing those details. And then only when those are all in order does the production start. So when people show up on time or there's various details that unfold during the production that seem seamless, it's only because of the pre-production and pre-production preparation. And then it's a long journey to make a film. And then, the outcome of which you hope is good. But like all our films are tested with audiences. The very first film we did called Stevie, documentary, it was well received with Steve James, who is the director of that film. When we got involved to help him produce that film, I said, one of the things we want to do is we want to do test screenings. Because I was so used to asking our customers, what do they think of our services? How can we improve our services? And I thought, well, we should do the same thing in our film. You don't want to ask those questions when the film is done and nothing can change. You want to ask when it's still in process. And he gave me a hard time at first, but finally agreed. And it was very helpful to that film. And every film that we've done since then has gone through pretty extensive audience testing to see what they thought and what we could expect and what we could do to make the experience better for an audience. Just like I was doing with the security company. What can we do to have a better experience for a client of ours? Because then they would recommend us to other people. And the film industry is very, very much word of mouth. So it's a matter of satisfying an audience with the stories that you want to tell. So I did see some similarities that others didn't.
It sounds to me like a good example of people that I've known that have had a career in one industry, but move into another, only to find that the career they're coming from greatly advantages them in regard to what it brought to the table of that second career. There's that learned experience on top of the passion that they have about going in that new direction, which certainly that sounds like what happened to you. You know, it was like these worlds collided, and maybe they weren't very different. But boy, what you learned from the first one surely played a big role in your success in the second one. In the one you're in now, you know, you've talked a lot about telling stories, and you enjoy that piece of it. And some of the work you've done, for example, Kids for Cash, a documentary, a true story about a judge in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, who imprisoned juvenile children only to have it discovered that he received kickbacks from the privately owned juvenile detention center where the kids were incarcerated. You know, then you have another example, something like The Station Agent, a comedy drama about three people with nothing in common except their shared solitude until chance circumstances bring them together. Those are different types of work. And I know earlier you had mentioned at the very beginning, director, producer, writer, and you're not doing each of those on the different films you work on. You might be doing one or the other, or maybe both or three at times. But in this regard, what types of stories do you like to tell? And is there a role that you prefer? You talked about the minutia of producing. Do you love the minutia of producing? Or is it the director role that you're yearning for? Or is it something different each time? And in regard to that, in any of those roles, what sort of story do you like to tell?
Well, I would say that there is a commonality in every story that we've told. In fact, there's a section of our website I know that kind of goes into that. As I said earlier, I'm interested in stories about people in circumstances that we could perhaps identify with, maybe not want to be in those circumstances, or maybe we would want to be in those circumstances, but like circumstances that are perhaps more extraordinary. So if you take The Station Agent, that was a film, first-time director Tom McCarthy. Nobody wanted to make that film. And because I was relatively new in the business, it came to me and I loved it from the first time of reading the script, loved it. I thought it was an example of prejudice that we hadn't quite seen before. And it was an example of friendship coming together. It was an example of tragedy that happened to one of the characters. It was an example of isolation that we all can go through. It was an example of reaching out to someone who may be isolated from the world. And so I just thought it was a beautiful story, but it was a first-time director and writer. And that excited me. I was very interested in the fact that Tom McCarthy hadn't directed or written a film before, and I was new in producing anyway, but I applied the skills that I felt I had to making that movie. And, you know, it was a remarkable experience for all of us. Now, Stevie was a whole different thing because that's a very tough story. It was well received, but it was about a kid that was abandoned by his parents, then grandparents. He got into foster care. The school system abandoned him also. In school, they locked him in a room because they couldn't deal with him. They didn't know how to deal with him. That was probably the springboard for me to be interested in the Kids for Cash project, because for Cash was about these kids and families who were going through a very difficult time. But I knew that if we just told that story, that's not going to be that interesting. So in that particular case, I really wanted to see what many people would refer to as the villain's side of the story too, which is Judge Chivarella, the juvenile court judge. I wanted to be able to talk with both kids and families and the judges at the center of the scandal. And those judges were going through a federal prosecution at the time. And I thought there was no chance that they would agree to talk with us. But after a number of conversations and meetings, they agreed as long as we kept them participating confidential. So for 3.5 years, we interviewed them and the kids and the families and then juxtaposed the two stories together. The film takes no position on either side, but it shows how these things happen.
It sounds to me like it would be very challenging whether you read a script or you know there's a story out there and you have this intense passion about the story. It connects with you on a very deep level. The challenge is going to be when you put this out, is it going to connect with people the way it connected with me? And I would imagine that's difficult. And it sounds like you've done a great job in all of the work you've done in whatever role you've played in making that happen. And if we could, just for a minute, we talked a little bit earlier about the different directions you've gone in over your life on your career path. You know, we've talked about a dad who was a pragmatic guy who kind of encouraged you to make sure you went down a path that would be a little bit safer and would guarantee maybe a little bit more of a steady income. It reminds me of a story with my older brother who wanted to be a commercial artist, and my parents said, you need to get a real job. But my brother wound up doing it, and he was very successful and remained successful at that. So you had that. And then over a successful career, and you did all those things that, led you to where you are today, you find yourself at something like the Oscars. A project you worked on is up for an Academy Award, and you're sitting there, and the project wins the Oscar. What was going through your head at that moment?
Well, a couple stories about the Fog of War. One was, first of all, Stevie, which was the first documentary that I did, that was shortlisted for Academy Award and then never made it through the rest of the process. Actually, we had a number of our documentaries that were shortlisted, but didn't get through the rest of the process. But that one did. And it's funny because Robert McNamara, who is the subject of the Fog of War, who was Secretary of Defense during the Kennedy administration, he told the filmmaker, the director, ErrolMorris, that he agreed to do the documentary, but the night before or a couple days before, he talked to ErrolMorris and he basically said, I've written all my books. I've talked about my life extensively. Most of my family and friends, whatever, suggest, why would I ever get on camera? Why would I do this? There's no reason for me to do this. I have nothing more to say. And of course, Errol is thinking, oh no, he's canceling. But he, true to form with McNamara, he said, but I made a commitment to you, so I'm going to go ahead with it. And then, I don't know, partway through filming, he said, you're probably going to win an Academy Award for this. And the funny thing is that he wasn't even a moviegoer. He had no idea what he was talking about. And that's like a curse when somebody says something like that when you're making a film, because that's not what's on your mind. Of course, you have dream about those things, but it was like, first you have to do the work. In this industry, see, in the security industry, you can go open up an Excel spreadsheet, you can make forecasts and you meet them, you don't, or you can put together all those sorts of plans. But in a film, you can do the best job you possibly can, make a movie that people just don't connect with. In the Fog of War, people connected, thought it was important. It was nominated for an Oscar. And yeah, it was a great experience going there and experiencing the whole thing. As a matter of fact, I sat next to one of the executives from Lionsgate who had released Stevie, and Stevie was shortlisted for an Oscar and didn't win. I mean, it didn't even get nominated because there's a process. When you shortlist, then there's a nomination, then maybe you win. And we all thought that there was a number of reasons why it wasn't nominated, we felt. And, we kind of felt like it should have been because it was an important film and well told. So I happened to be sitting next to him at the Oscars when they announced the Fog of War had won. And it was one of those double take sort of things. It's like, wait, did they say our name? And sure enough, they did. And the Fog of War was a great experience all the way around because, not just because of the Oscar, but because it was an important film. I went to Cannes with that film. I also was invited by the State Department to take the Fog of War and the Station Agent to the Middle East. And we went to Lebanon, Oman, and we presented the film there, both the Fog of War and the Station Agent. So those films afforded a lot of opportunity to really share the stories that I and so many others are so passionate about. We won a Bafta for the Station Agent, and I will tell you a little bit about that if you want to hear it. So we're in London where the BAFTAs are announced, and I'm sitting next to Tom McCarthy, the director, and they announced the Station Agent won the BAFTA, and we thought we were up against a Pixar movie, and we weren't going to win. And we just both sat there, like we didn't move. And then finally, there was a guy from Miramax next to me, and he taps me, he said, you won. And I look over to Tom and said, we won. And he's like, what? Like they said our name. And it took forever for him to get up on stage. And everybody laughed about it because he told that story when he got up there. But you dream about those moments, but to have those moments is another thing that don't happen that often.
You're always working and you're always looking ahead. And for all of us, I think at times it's hard to be in the moment, but having the opportunity after to reflect back is a wonderful thing. And to appreciate it like you do is evident that you enjoyed every minute of that for sure. And here we are as we wrap up. We've talked a lot about your story today. And if you could, maybe as an active doer, because you are in the doing stages of what your career is now. As an active doer, what advice, words of wisdom, or encouragement would you give to an avid dreamer that might be listening?
I've always felt it's about commitment and passion. If you have a passion to do something, I think you owe it to yourself to explore how you could do that thing, whatever it is. And then when you decide, like, I think I can do that, It's really the commitment to see it through. So many times people have ideas and they feel like, oh, how am I going to do that? I can't do that. When I got into the security business, I didn't know I was going to do that. I had no idea really, but I figured I'll figure it out. I'll learn. And when I got into the film business, it was a very similar thing. Like I didn't know what I was doing, but I'll figure it out. The other big thing is I sought people that I thought would be willing to help me. And I've never stopped doing that. And when people that are already doing what you want to do, when you approach them, most people will say, sure, they'd be glad to help. And most people are afraid to do that. So if there's something you want to do and you're passionate about it and you know, and you see someone, even if it's someone you don't know and you wouldn't even know how to get in contact with, they're doing what you want to do, figure out how to get in touch with them and try to just have a 5-minute chat to help fulfill or feed your passion, and then don't give up.
I really appreciate that. There's a great lesson that I think a lot of the younger generation can learn from what you just said. And in a nutshell, it's figure it out. And if there's a passion and you have an interest, figure it out. And that could go a long way for a lot of people. Robert, I can't thank you enough for being here today. Your story is fascinating. The things you've done are incredible. And as we're ending, the parting words are inspiring to those that might be listening. So thank you for your time. I wish you nothing but the best on all of what you're doing in the future. And I know we're going to see a lot of the art you're putting out as we move ahead. So thank you for that as well.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to share the story.
Thank you. I've been talking with Robert May, producer, director, writer, and creator of CenArt Films. I encourage you to check out Robert's work and please visit his website at cenartfilms.com. This has been Harmony Talk by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm Greg Frigoletto. Thank you to Robert May for being with us today. To our listeners, continue to dream and keep doing.